Will a war in China also mean a war with North Korea? Is the formation of American alliances in the Western Pacific accounting for a simultaneous war in the region? The United States and its allies in the Western Pacific are in the process of forming or upgrading existing defensive alliances to counter expected threats in the region. The U.S., its Asian allies, and to a lesser extent its European allies, have made their primary focus realizing that China's actions directly impact regional European security, particularly their economic security. Europe's ability to provide military deterrence in the Asia-Pacific region is limited, and any assistance it has suggested has led China to accuse Europe of attempting to establish an Asian NATO. The United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines will primarily form defensive alliances against potential adversaries of China, North Korea, and possibly Russia, and Taiwan positioned between these two power struggles. Miscalculations can lead to disastrous consequences, prompting the question, is the U.S. foreign and defense policy in the region a suitable approach to counter the potential threats? During the later stages of the Cold War, the United States had a stated military policy that it would be capable of fighting two near-simultaneous wars and winning both wars. The primary threat was the Soviet Union in Europe, followed by North Korea and possibility of the Soviet Union in the Asia-Pacific region. At the time, China was a continental power in Asia and could not project its power much beyond its contiguous borders. After the two communist countries split as allies in the 1960s, China posed a threat to the Soviet Union. There was a possibility that China could intervene in a new Korean War, but this was unlikely, given that during the Cold War, North Korea was firmly on the side of the Soviet Union and significantly less on the side of China. So the threat was much different back then than it is now, as China lacked the military capacity or ambition seen in the modern times. The 1990-1991 Gulf War also benefited from this winning two simultaneous war doctrine, as Saudi Arabia received forces normally allocated to European defense, while forces in the Pacific remained largely in place to counter North Korea should it seek to exploit the Middle East crisis. During Desert Shield, the U.S. buildup in the Persian Gulf included not only forces earmarked for Europe, but also rapid deployment forces like the United States Marine Corps and the U.S. Army 18th Airborne Corps, which largely adhered to this arrangement with some minor exceptions. The U.S., like much of the former bipolar world, reacted to the reduced global threat after the Cold War and took advantage of the peace dividend, which allowed spending on other priorities to take precedence over while reducing defense budgets. As a result, the United States did not anticipate the need or desire to allocate resources for the previous simultaneous two-war win doctrine, but rather envisioned fighting two simultaneous wars, albeit with a significant modification. The United States would fight one war with the goal of achieving a decisive victory while defending the other, until it transferred the forces from the other war to the defensive war and pursued a decisive victory there. The immediate Cold War environment significantly simplified the security environment, and neither China nor Russia were considered peer adversaries. That has changed as an aggressive Russian policy has returned to Europe, and China has immensely increased its economy, military capability, and ambitions since the end of the Cold War. The current formation of Western Pacific alliances serves two envisioned purposes. The first purpose is China's military rise and its increasingly bellicose regional threats, as well as how to counter or prepare for them. The second purpose concerns North Korea's persistent and unpredictable threat against South Korea, Japan, and the United States, as well as the most effective strategies to counter it. One can legitimately debate whether the preparations for threats in the region are correct, escalatory, or insufficient to counteract the anticipated threats. The concern lies in the fact that the threat preparations in the Western Pacific and Indo-Pacific regions focus on two distinct threats, China and North Korea, without considering the possibility that these two threats might merge into a single threat. This could potentially overwhelm the preparations, which treat each threat as mutually exclusive when there is a high likelihood of their intertwining and being mutually inclusive. The U.S.-led alliance system needs to recognize that the two tracks of threats in the region and does not publicly acknowledge the potential of a combined single threat. For instance, South Korea has primarily concentrated on security alliances with the U.S., whereas Japan has devoted nearly all its attention to the North Korean threat. South Korea has gone out of its way as a matter of policy not to antagonize China too much, with the goal of preventing China from intervening on the side of North Korea as it did in 1950 if the war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula. In support of this policy, South Korea could initiate the first strike against North Korea, and if it were in a position to defeat North Korea, it would need to exercise caution due to Chinese concerns about the presence of a U.S. ally on its southern border and the potential loss of a buffer state. This is much of the strategic dilemma that China faced when it decided to enter the Korean War in October 1950, when the UN and U.S. forces overran most of North Korea and were approaching the Yalu River on the Chinese border. In order to avoid antagonizing China too much, South Korea has carefully avoided joining alliances in the Pacific that focus solely on China. The Philippines, for example, have announced they have no strategic interest in the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan, so they see the China threat through a much more focused lens. South Korean position is understandable, but the major issue is the unpredictability and opportunism of North Korea over Chinese aggression in the region, such as an invasion of Taiwan. If China initiates an invasion of Taiwan, attracting the attention of the U.S. and Japanese forces, it could create a window of opportunity for North Korea to invade South Korea as the U.S. and its allies can concentrate on countering the Chinese threat. This would be the best opportunity for North Korea to fulfill its long-term goals. Another factor to consider is North Korea's significant reliance on China for security. If China loses, North Korea will become increasingly isolated and its survival will become more challenging because Russia won't be able to cover all the gaps China currently fills for Pyongyang. If China were to go to war, North Korea would have the incentive to initiate a conflict with South Korea. This would present North Korea with its prime opportunity to achieve its long-term strategic objectives, as well as its only chance to ensure its long-term survival. Therefore, South Korea's decision to avoid provoking China and not support a coalition aimed at deterring Chinese aggression specifically could potentially compromise its security interests. Another aspect of the issue is that North Korea's involvement in the early stages of a Chinese war in the Western Pacific could significantly benefit China. The North Koreans could target U.S. assets near the Korean Peninsula, such as Okinawa, Guam, which would also benefit China. This is because these assets could not be used against China, as they would be either destroyed or needed for South Korea's defense. If North Korea doesn't coordinate with China, it can effectively restrict North Korea's involvement in the Korean conflict and to the defense of its own territory. However, this strategy only works if North Korea doesn't appear to be coordinating with China. Eventually, the distinction between North Korean and Chinese actions would blur, but initially it would pose strategic challenges to the U.S., Japan, and South Korea and other allies in the Pacific region. At the outset, China's only concern was avoiding involvement in the Korean Peninsula conflict. Every attack that North Korea makes against U.S. and Japanese assets is a service to China's cause. This is a problem for alliances in the Pacific between the United States and its allies. Outside of a minor incursion, a conflict with China will likely incentivize a North Korean attack, as it perceives this is the best opportunity for strategic gain or the only hope for its long-term survival, and China has little incentive to dissuade North Korean action. The U.S. and its allies must view a conflict with China as all-encompassing of the Western Pacific strategic dilemma. Other variables include Russia's and India's involvement, as well as the use of nuclear weapons by either side of the conflict. It is not an effortless decision for China to have its well-prepared military and political plans dependent on, tied to, or destroyed by an unpredictable leader of North Korea, who tends to act in his own interests when the time comes. The complexity and danger of a war in the Western Pacific could surpass expectations, and any doctrine needs to consider this despite the foreign policy and political downside it would create.